My father went missing when I was 13 years old. There weren't any reasons or goodbyes. He just vanished. Even though I was still young when he left, I knew my father really well, and there was something very odd about his disappearance. My mother, Rita Smith, believed that he had run away, and that was what she told everyone, but the running away story seemed out of place as he had left all his clothing, his car, his wallet, basically all his belongings at home. No one ran away with nothing, and as the days passed by, it soon became clear to everyone that he was taken against his own will, and it wasn't long before he was deemed a missing person. The police and the detectives were soon involved in the matter. They carried out their routine questions, but that got them nowhere, so a massive search began. As I said earlier, I had just turned 13 at this point, so I was still a little kid, but I made sure that I joined every single search party that was carried out for my father. My mom wasn't too happy about this, as she said that I was too young to be joining the search parties, but I didn't care. All I wanted to do was to find my father. I might have only known him for 12 years, but I loved that man with all my heart. I knew that he wouldn't just leave, which is why I never agreed with my mom's claims. And since I now knew that there was a possibility he was out there, I swore that I would never give up until I found him. The first year soon passed by, and neither the police nor the search parties could find anything. As the second year started, I noticed that the efforts to find him from both the detectives and the search parties had reduced drastically. By the third year, the case had gone cold and the support from the community and the authorities had completely stopped. I watched as everyone around me stopped caring as they all assumed he was probably dead now. But even then, I was the only one who didn't stop or give up. I refused to believe that he was dead, as I knew he was out there. I was angry because I had to do it alone now, but I didn't blame anyone. I already knew people started to forget as time goes by, but he was my father, so I couldn't forget. Searching for my father became my #1 priority as I searched for him every single day after school. I searched in the woods surrounding our house, and I went from door to door asking if anyone had information about his whereabouts. My entire family, especially my mother, was worried about my well-being as they begged me to stop, but I didn't listen. I didn't know why, but for some reason, I had this feeling every night while I lay on my bed that my father was close to me. My family had already accepted his unproven demise, but I had a gut feeling that he was out there, and I knew that I was close to him, which is why I didn't stop. As the years went by, my determination to find my father only increased, and my focus never wavered. I knew that I would find him one day, no matter how long it took. And unbeknownst to me, at that time, that day was quickly approaching. At this point, it had been about 8 years since my father's disappearance. I was 21 at the time, and I was in college studying criminal justice and criminology, with hopes of becoming a detective in the future. The year was 2009, and I had just come home from spring break. As I always continued my search whenever I came home. But it'd been 8 years of searching, and I hadn't found anything. So I decided to take a different approach. It'd been a while, but I decided to try to remember the last night I had seen my father. I essentially took my mind back to the crime scene to see if there was anything that I could pick up or notice. Since it was a traumatic event that happened during my childhood, I didn't have much trouble recollecting the events of that night. I was watching cartoons on the couch, and I remember my parents talking. They weren't arguing, but I could tell that they were having a pretty serious conversation. They talked for a couple of minutes before they went into my room for privacy. I'm guessing they didn't want me to hear what they were talking about. I'm pretty sure I slept on the couch that night, and that was the last time I saw my dad. After calmly recollecting the events of that night, I realized a very important detail. My mother, Rita, was the last person to see my dad before he disappeared. So I decided to talk to her. She was sitting in the living room, and I remember asking her if she could tell me anything that happened that night. My mother paused before saying, "It's been 8 years, Henry. 8 years since your father disappeared, and you're still on this wild goose chase? I know you loved your father. We all did. But don't you think it's time to let it go? You've let this entire incident consume you and define your life. You wanted to be a pilot when you were little, but You're studying criminology now because you want to be a detective and chase down your father? Please, son, I'm begging you to just let this go. I've already lost a husband, and I don't want to lose a son. My mother had tears in her eyes now. I knew my obsession with my father's disappearance bothered her and the family, but I didn't know it was that bad. I also knew that my mother, Rita, was a very good person. She had kind eyes, and she always found a way to smile, even when she was down. I didn't want to make her sad, so I apologized for my questions and went to my room. As I lay on my bed, my mother's words started to ring in my head, as I wondered if I had let the disappearance of my father consume me. I started to rethink everything at this point, as I thought about what I should do. But for some bizarre reason, I suddenly felt an incessant need to search my room. I knew it sounded crazy, but it was the last place I had seen my father before he disappeared, and as ridiculous as it sounded, I got up and started searching. I searched my cupboards, looked into the massive trunk in my room, and I even got a ladder to search my ceiling. I had torn my room apart at this point, and the only place I hadn't checked was under my bed. As I got on my knees to search, I remembered how my father would often play with me in my room, and he'd always say, "There's something under the bed," before reaching under my bed and pulling out a couple of my toys that I had thrown under there since I was a pretty messy kid. He'd then tell me to take care of my toys and to always arrange them properly after playing. These memories ran through my head as I pushed my bed to the side. As expected, underneath my bed was completely empty, as there was nothing there. But I did, however, notice something very strange. You see, we used wooden floors in our entire house, and for some unknown reason, the color of the wood under my bed was different from the color of the wood in my entire room. The wood under my bed had a light brown color, while the wood that covered the rest of my room was dark mahogany. I didn't need anyone to tell me that the wood around this area had been replaced, and I wondered why. I then knocked on that area of replaced wood, and to my surprise, it was hollow. So without a second thought, I got a crowbar and started tearing it open. It took me about 15 minutes to completely tear the floor apart, and when I was done, I stood in horror, as right under the wooden floor were human remains. I screamed as I hoped it wasn't who I thought it was, but deep down, I already knew who it was. My scream attracted my mother, who was now standing in my doorway. She was holding something behind her back and crying. I was still in shock, and I wondered what she was doing, but before I could ask, my mother said, "You just couldn't leave it alone, could you? You just don't know when to give up. I thought we could move past this, but I see that's impossible. You are your father's son. You've destroyed this family now, and I hope you're happy, but I won't let this home crumble without a fight." And with that, she lunged at me with a knife. I was overwhelmed with emotions at that point, as I had just found my father's remains under my bed, and for some bizarre reason, my own mother was now trying to kill me. I tried to maneuver her attacks, but I was injured in the process. My mother's kind eyes were now bloodshot red, and she continued to viciously attack me. There are no words to explain how I felt watching my mother attempt to kill me, but I kept my composure and managed to subdue her. She screamed and she thrashed about when I held her down, and the loud noises made our neighbors call 911. So it wasn't long before the police arrived. The revelations after that fateful day were nothing but shocking. An autopsy was carried out on the human remains, and it was confirmed to be my father, Joseph Smith. Apparently, he'd been stabbed in the throat by my mother that night. She then managed to wrap the corpse, pull the floorboards under my bed, and place the corpse under the wooden floor before covering it up with spare wood from the shed. Detectives questioned my mother Rita for an explanation or motive for the murder of my father, and while she did confess, she gave no reason as to why she killed her husband or why she tried to kill me. After some psychological evaluations, numerous specialists stated that my mother may be suffering from a peculiar form of both dissociative identity disorder, DID, and paranoid personality disorder, PPD, due to the contrast between her usual behavior and her behavior on the night of the murder, and on the day she attacked me. They then added that she might also be suffering from a unique form of both schizophrenia and paranoid schizophrenia. I would have never guessed that my mother Rita suffered from these mental health issues, as she always seemed calm and docile in front of us, and it pains me to think that she had watched me search for my father all these years while knowing that he was under my very own bed. The morbid case shook our entire town, and it basically destroyed our family. My mother was put in a psychiatric facility to undergo further examinations for 6 months, and when she was released, she stood trial. Her defense tried to plead not guilty by reason of insanity due to dissociative identity disorder, but she was found guilty for the murder, as the court stated that the condition does not preclude criminal responsibility. The judge stated that even though an individual may have distinct personalities that control his or her behavior, they are still liable for their actions. So she was sentenced to life in prison. It's been about 14 years since this incident. I sometimes wish that I didn't find my father's remains, as my actions have torn our family apart. But during those moments, I reminded myself how much I wanted to get justice for my father, and I don't regret it. I graduated, and I am currently a part of the New York City Police Department. I work under the Detective Bureau. I usually specialize in missing person cases, as I hope to bring peace of mind to all those who went through or who are still going through what I did when I was 13.
Hello, guys. My name is Barry. I'm just an ordinary person like you. But recently, something happened that I just couldn't ignore. Something that gave purpose to my life. Something that changed me forever. Before I tell you what happened, you should know something about me. As a child, I was a missing person. Some men kidnapped me right after school and demanded a huge reward for me. My parents had to go into a huge amount of debt to pay the ransom, and the police never found out, as my parents were told that they would hurt me if they did. 30 years have passed since that fateful day. As soon as I was old enough, I moved out of that town, as everything reminded me of my time in captivity. But you know what? I decided to go back. I knew I had to fight my fears, and this was a great opportunity to see my parents, my brother, and my nephew, whom I've never met until now. Once I got back here, all the memories came flooding back. The darkness of the night, the abandoned factory where they kept me, the street where they put me in that huge white van. All these things seemed like a part of a distant nightmare, and now they had become real. Once I got home, I settled into what used to be my room and adapted to the town for the next few days. I knew that being here was going to be difficult, but somehow I was managing. I spent time with my family, and my nephew had a chance to get to know me. For several days I was happy, but I couldn't help but think that something was wrong. A few days later, I was watching the news on TV. Some children in the village had been kidnapped, and among them was my nephew. I was shocked by the news. My brother still hadn't told me anything. Why? So as not to scare our parents? I felt a huge sense of panic and decided to turn off the TV, as to not think about it, even for a few seconds. At that moment, I could escape from the TV, but not from my phone, which began to ring violently. Hello? Turning off the TV won't stop the kids from disappearing, Barry. What? Who are you? How do you know my name? Come on. Don't be naive. You recognize my voice. He was right. I recognized that voice. I don't know what you're talking about. Is that so? Don't you recognize your kidnapper, Barry? How do you know it's me? How did you know I was watching TV? Why are you doing this to me? Nobody in my family has any money. We lost everything because of you. You're getting confused. We didn't kidnap for money. We have a score to settle, and we want to pay it. What? Those children, including your nephew, will die if you don't rescue them, Barry. Only you can do that. You know where we are, and you know what will happen if you call the police." And without another word, the man simply hung up the phone. I fell to the floor, collapsed, without energy, crying. It was all happening, again, only worse since it was now personal. I decided to go to my truck as soon as I could, but this time, I didn't make the same mistake. This time I left a note for my parents to call the police. I didn't want to risk calling myself. Who knows if this person had my phone tapped or was watching me all the time? Otherwise, how else would he know so much about what I was doing at that time? I sped up my car and headed for the one place I assumed I would find the children, the abandoned warehouse. Once I arrived, I set up the kitchen knife I had put away before I left and went into the place. As I guessed, the kids were there. Suddenly, my cell phone rang, and I quickly answered it. "I told you not to contact the police." But I didn't. Suddenly, the phone call was interrupted with a huge man grabbing my shoulder. As I turned around, I realized it was him, the same person who had kidnapped me as a child. The man had a terrifying mask, and his whole body was covered with a huge jacket. But that didn't matter. I could recognize him instantly. I did it just by looking at his body, listening to his voice, watching how he stood. This, without hesitation, was my hijacker. Without hesitating for a second, the man brutally beat me and knocked me down. The gagged children tried to scream, but the air didn't leave their lungs. They were truly terrified, crying. The giant kidnapper kept hitting me again and again, incessantly. I pulled out the knife and tried to attack him, but he knocked it out of my hand without any difficulty. "You can't rescue them, Barry. Your nephew is dead. They're all dead. As soon as I'm done with you, I'll make you look at every one of their dead bodies. This is your fault." I tried to get up slowly and walk towards the children in panic. I was ready to die. Maybe this way I could free the children. Suddenly, the warehouse door opened, and behind them stood the police. I had saved myself. They pointed their guns, asking for the release of the children. Something was wrong. The cops were pointing their guns at me. Frightened, I raised my hands. The kidnapper was no longer there. Had he fled? When I raised my hands, I realized something. I still had the knife in my hand. Hadn't the kidnapper taken it out of my hand? The cops came rushing in my direction, and I just bent down and threw the knife as far as I could. The cops arrested me and released the children. I thought they would say I was innocent, but for some reason they say I kidnapped them. Why did they do that? Had they been threatened? I was found guilty of kidnapping, but they didn't arrest me. They sent me to a mental health institute. The psychiatrist always tells me that I did what I did because I never had closure with what I experienced as a child. She told me that the kidnapper is inside my head, and that I could never separate from him or get over what I went through. His influence became so great that my psyche split into two. He told me that I had been so traumatized by what happened, so scared because the real kidnapper was never found, that I decided to create my own closure. I decided that one way or another, I was going to face him, even if he wasn't real. He also told me that none of those phone calls were real, as there was no record on either the home phone or my cell phone. Since I've been in the psychiatric hospital, I pretend that everyone is right, and I pretend that I'm recovering. But I know I'm not. I'm sure that what I experienced is real. I will prove to everyone that day the kidnapper escaped. Everyone will see that I'm right, whatever it takes.
My name is Cameron John, and for some time in my life, I lived shortly with a foster family as both my parents had passed away when I was 9 years old. My mom died from diabetes, and my dad died from a heart attack not long after. Understandably, the years that followed that incident were horrible for me, but to this day, no experience has been as horrifying as the Bishop's foster family. It all started shortly after my father passed. I was a 9-year-old only child with almost no immediate relatives, so it didn't take long for child services to arrive and take me away. I was informed there was nothing to be worried about as they already had a foster family assigned to me. The ward also informed me that my new foster family was well known and had previously taken care of up to 13 kids in the past, and the government trusted them completely with the safety of kids like me. The next day, I was put in a car with my ward and taken to my new home. As we arrived, the first thing I noticed was the home was in a very remote area. A large house stood alone surrounded by a massive field, and the whole thing was surrounded by a fence. It was a beautiful sight if I'm being honest, but at the time, nothing could really make me happy. We drove past the gate and towards the house where a group of people stood waiting. Out the window, I noticed an extra person mowing the field. He should have been around 6'7", but his clothes hinted he wasn't a part of the family, so I simply looked away. I stepped down from the car and realized the group was made up of 9 people. The father was dressed in a black and white priest gown, and the mother, something similar with a scarf on her head. The 7 kids behind them varied in ethnicity and age, but I could tell just by looking that amongst them, I would be the youngest. The mother immediately walked up to me and gave me a tight hug. She pulled away saying, "Hello, Cameron. We know it's been a hard few days, but you'll be fine. Welcome to the Bishop family." The days after that were completely normal. I was introduced to the kids and discovered I was right in assuming I'd be the youngest, as the one closest to me was a 12-year-old girl named Angela. Ironically, it turned out Mr. Bishop was an actual priest, and for the little time I'd spent at the house, I'd never seen him in anything other than his black and white gown. The large man I saw mowing the lawn was in the house regularly and seemed to be part of the family. Everyone called him Uncle Sam, and when he wasn't mowing, he'd be fixing something or talking with the adults. I spent most of my time outside in the fields reading, as the kids weren't allowed to go to school. Instead, we were homeschooled by Mother and spent most of the day doing nothing. "Guys, aren't you sometimes bored staying home all day?" It took some time, but eventually Angela responded, "Father and Mother say we aren't ready yet." She continued with, "They say if we go outside, the demons will come for us, and nobody wants that." I was confused as I figured we'd all been outside at least once in the past before coming here, but that's when the oldest child, Arthur, spoke. "Besides, I don't know about you, but we're happy here. There's no purpose for people like us out there. Here's safe and the outside isn't. There's way too many sinners out there, and quite simply, it's disgusting." He paused and held contact before saying, "Also, the demons that took our parents are still out there. We need to be complete or they'll take us too." I didn't know what it was at that time, but after that conversation, I never felt right being with the other kids. I simply cried that night and went to bed. I woke up later that night to use the toilet, and I could tell it was really late at night, but as I walked towards the bathroom, I began hearing muffled noises. I couldn't tell where they were coming from, but after noticing them, I couldn't stop noticing. I decided it was probably nothing, simply got back in bed and chose to ignore the noises that night. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about those noises I heard the previous night, so I decided to ask Mother and Father. I woke up last night to pee, and I heard a couple of weird noises. Do you guys know what they were?" Father kept his usual expressionless face and simply looked away, but Mother looked at me and replied, "Now, Cameron, you shouldn't have been awake so late at night. That's when the demons come out. You're simply not yet complete, so it's not safe. But don't worry, we'll take care of you till you're ready." She plastered a smile on her face and left. Every night after that, I woke up around the same time to hear the same noises I heard that night. A part of me was curious, but I was mostly scared by what Mother had said, so I would always force myself back to sleep. That was until that horrible night. I had been living with the Bishops for 3 months now, and for almost 2 whole months, I had been hearing the same muffled noises every night from somewhere in the house. So I decided it was time to finally check it out. I woke up at the same time I always did, and sure enough, I could hear the muffled noises. Although I wasn't close to any, my plan was simply to get one of the other kids to come look with me. I walked into Arthur's room first, but his bed was completely empty. I figured he probably had to use the bathroom, so decided to get someone else, but shockingly, all 7 rooms were identical, with all 7 beds being completely empty. My naive mind immediately began to think back to what Mother had told me about the demons, and it didn't take long for my palms to start sweating and my stomach to drop. I began to think the demons had taken everyone else and I was next, so completely scared, I headed for the parents' room. I had never gone in there before, but my fear wasn't letting me think clearly, so I walked right in without knocking and shut the door. It took a while for me to catch my breath, but when I did, I turned to see a large bed that stood in an odd position, almost like it had been moved, and just like the other rooms, no one was in it. It was only at this point I noticed the muffled noises seemed louder and were obviously coming from this room. More importantly, they weren't muffled, and I could now tell without a doubt that they were in fact voices. I slowly approached the bed, and sure enough, it had been moved to reveal a wooden staircase that led to the voices I had been hearing. I couldn't tell what was happening from where I was standing, but for some reason, I was scared, as I didn't know what I would see, but I knew for a fact it wasn't something I was meant to see. Against my better judgment, I slowly walked down the staircase until I could see. My heart dropped immediately. I saw what was going on. The Bishop family, all dressed in Father's black and white gown. They stood in a circle, and in the middle was a middle-aged man in his underwear. The man was knelt down with both hands chained to the walls. His body had marks all over, and his mouth was gagged shut. It also looked like his head had been shaved, and there were pieces of leftover hair on his head. The family was constantly chanting the words, "To purge the sinner, to purge the sinner, to purge the sinner." But eventually, Father walked towards the man and signaled for silence. He then proceeded to say, "Family, we are gathered here once more because evil never rests. That is why we will never rest." He paused to collect a knife from Arthur before continuing with, "Bishops, what is our purpose?" They all responded once more with the words, "To purge the sinner." At this point, I was completely gripped by fear, but I had just realized the family was crazy, knew I had to get out of the house quickly. But as I turned to leave, the stairs let out a large creak, and immediately, the family turned to see me. "Cameron, I told you not to be up by this time. We haven't even started your lessons yet." Mother looked at me more disappointed than shocked, and none of the family members even seemed to care about the fact I, a 9-year-old child, had seen what they were doing. That's when Father said, "It's fine, Madeline. Come, Cameron." He gestured for me to walk towards him. I slowly walked back down to him, and he placed a hand around my shoulder before facing me towards the chained-up man, saying, "The lessons on humanity we teach you are just that, lesson. What makes you a truly complete human is moments like these. The man before you is a sinner." His scream startled me, and I began to cry. "Sin is the reason God punishes us. Why he's taken all your families. Sinners are the reason you are alone in this world. Now, will you allow more pain and suffering, Cameron? It's your duty to prevent that. So here." At this point, he forced the knife into my hand and pushed me closer to the man. "Cut his throat, Cameron, and become complete. You are no longer alone. You are now a bishop. And what is the duty of a bishop?" The room replied, "To purge the sinner." I was shaking now, and I could tell the man in front of me was just as scared as I was. I continued to cry as he held my shoulders and repeated the words, "Purge the sinner." Eventually, I was able to gather my thoughts, and as Father repeated those words, I took the knife and stabbed it in his leg. He instantly let out a screeching sound, and I immediately ran up the stairs and out of the room. I didn't stop running, and it wasn't long till I was out the door and headed for the gate. But I soon heard footsteps behind me and turned to see the looming figure of Uncle Sam charging towards me. He wasn't close initially, but every time I turned, he seemed closer and closer. I could now see the gate and what seemed like headlights coming towards it. And at that moment, all I could do was hope I got there before Uncle Sam got to me. I ran out the gate and fell hard on the road. The car headed my way abruptly stopped, and seated in the driver's seat was an elderly lady.
"Is everything all right, young man?"
she said, looking out the window. I quickly ran to the other side crying and said, "Please help me, ma'am. Please. They're trying to kill me." The initial confusion was written all over the woman's face, but she simply opened the door and I quickly got in. As we drove off, I looked out the corner of my eye to see Uncle Sam standing by the open gate, staring furiously at me, and in the distance, the silhouette of who I assumed was Father staring out of a window from the house. Soon enough, the house was out of sight, and that would be the last time I would ever see the Bishop household. In the weeks that followed, I explained the situation to my ward and the officers in charge of the case. At first, they all thought I was an orphan acting out, but that view completely changed after they visited the home and found no trace of the Bishop family. Blood samples were found in the hidden basement I described, but most samples appeared to have a mixture of different people's DNA and proved inconclusively. In the end, only a few victims were identified. The fact I claimed to hear those noises every night for almost 2 months led authorities to believe the Bishop family had taken up to an estimated 200 lives in the past few years. The government ended up putting me in an orphanage for the next 9 years of my life, and as expected, I received regular therapy and counseling during my time in the orphanage. The truth is, anyone who hasn't been a foster kid can't truly understand the courage it takes to live with a complete group of strangers. The ideals, beliefs, and culture of these strangers may not be what we think they are. Some people get loving homes while others end up in the worst places imaginable, disguised as loving homes. I, on the other hand, was stuck in hell during my time in foster care, and I hope no one ever experiences what it's like to be a part of the Bishop foster care family.
Hey guys, my name is Angie, and I have a very difficult job. I check that foster care families meet all the requirements to care for a child until we find a family for them to be adopted. When the house is in order, it is the best time for my job, as the children are usually very happy. But it doesn't always go very well. There are other cases where the family lies in the interview or on the form, and when we check their homes to verify it, we find out the truth. Those cases are never good, as the family that was going to take care of the child ends up crying or getting angry. After a few years, you realize that all the patterns are similar, except for this family. The family seemed lovely, but I felt there was something off about them. When I went to interview them personally, I realized I should have followed my intuition. The house where they were going to care for the foster child was terrifying. There were knives on the floor, rats everywhere, and to make it worse, used toilet paper on the floor. It was disgusting. When I told the owners that I was not going to be able to accept them as foster parents, they didn't freak out. They didn't do anything. They just stared at me with a huge, disinterested smile. So far, that was my craziest story since I've been working here. Little did I know that something much worse was about to happen to me. A few days after that visit, I was on the bus telling that story to a friend on my cell phone. The bus was pretty empty, and it was late at night. I was late for a visit, and my husband's car was not working. I had thought about taking an Uber, but what the hell? I had ridden public transportation too many times to chicken out. As the bus continued to move forward, there were fewer and fewer people on it. So many people got off that I started to stare at the few that were left. Among them, 2 people caught my attention. There were 2 people in robes. They were both ahead of me, so I couldn't see their faces. But I could tell something They were laughing. They weren't laughing a lot, but in an unnatural way. They weren't looking at each other either. They were just looking straight ahead, laughing, not interacting. I started to get very nervous. I felt that these people were going to cause trouble, and I could not wait for them to get off. The bus stations went by, and people went by and by, but they were still there. Now they were not only laughing among themselves without looking at each other, but I could see them looking at me out of the corner of their eyes and laughing even louder than before. They weren't even looking at each other. I was all they could see. I felt very nervous and wanted to get off, but this neighborhood was quite dangerous. At least here I was protected, and these people wouldn't dare do anything with the driver around. I was coming to my stop and got up from my seat, but to my surprise, so did these two people. I sat down quickly and confirmed my suspicions. They sat down too. They didn't even bother to make it look casual. I was in danger, and they wanted me to know it. I stayed in my seat wondering what to do. My next move was obvious. I asked my husband to wait for me at the terminal station and told him that I was in danger. As long as I was on the bus, nothing could happen to me. The rest of the people kept getting off slowly until it was just us. We were one stop away from the terminal, and to my surprise, both people got off. Were they just messing with me? They both approached the driver's seat. Both the driver and I thought they were going to get off, but what they did next froze me in my tracks. One of them pulled out a handkerchief and began to press it in the face of the driver, who had just parked to get two people out. The driver fell asleep in a matter of seconds. That napkin must have had chloroform on it. Terrified, I watched as these two people began to walk towards me slowly, taking off their hoods and revealing their identities. I already knew these two people. They were the people who had applied to take care of a child for a month. They were the foster care parents that I rejected for having such strange behavior. I ran as fast as I could to the door, and at that moment I just realized what had happened. The driver was passed out. There was no one to open the door for me. The windows of the bus were sealed, and the ones that could be opened were too high and too small for me to get through. I was completely locked in. Knowing my situation, the couple walked slowly and casually toward me, enjoying every moment of panic that passed through my body. Surrendered, I fell into one of the back seats, and crying, I asked them not to do anything to me, that I was sorry for not giving them the custody of the child, that I would do everything I could to get them to adopt, but to please leave without hurting me. The people kept walking, ignoring every word I said. Suddenly, I had an idea. I grabbed one of the emergency hammers and pulled it out with all my strength. I started to hit the window, but it was too late. The two terrifying people were standing next to me, laughing their heads off, with a demented look in their eyes. The eyes of both people were huge. Veins ran down their faces, and their smiles reached from ear to ear. It was a huge smile of force. It was as if they couldn't stop laughing, even if they wanted to. Behind their laughter, their eyes reflected a terrible hatred for me. That day, I thought that they didn't care that I had rejected them, but now I realized that they did very much. I told them that if they took one more step, I would hit them with the hammer, but the threat didn't work. The man lunged at me and squeezed my eyes with his huge fingers. I had never felt so much pain in my life. It was the most horrible and strange sensation. I felt that my own eyes were about to explode against my brain. I managed to kick and run as fast as I could, but I was still on the bus. I tried to open my eyes, but the pain was too great, so I just kept the hammer in the air, hoping to hit someone, while I listened as the steps of two assailants came closer and closer. One of the two footsteps accelerated and rushed toward me. It was the woman. I could feel her nails digging into my legs, and a bite on my ankle numbed all my skin. As I screamed in pain, I heard the man's footsteps walking slowly toward me. Surely, he would be the one to finish me off. Still unable to open my eyes, I heard a glass next to me break, and someone walked up the steps to the front door. His voice was familiar. It was my husband. I heard a fight and people falling. I heard screams and suddenly silence. Footsteps approached me quickly. Whose were they? Terrified, I tried to defend myself until I heard my husband's voice telling me we had to leave as soon as possible. I felt him put me on his shoulder and ran as fast as he could. A few hours later, I was better. My eyes still hurt, but I was able to open them. We called the police, and when they went to check the bus, the unthinkable happened. Both psychopaths were still on the bus, laughing non-stop. They were eating the bus driver's body. The police stopped them. They didn't put up any resistance. They just kept on laughing. Once they were arrested, the police asked me to testify, and I told them everything. It was soon learned that these were two dangerous psychopaths who had escaped from a hospital many years before. Why they laughed so much, tried to take care of a child, or wanted to get back at me was a mystery. I am ashamed to admit this, but a part of me is grateful that they killed that poor bus driver. If they hadn't, these people would have gotten away. And who knows what they would have done to me if they had come across my path again.
Hi, my name is Mike. I consider myself an adventurer, a person who explores the whole world no matter what the destination is. Although, I must tell you the truth, I'm not your typical backpacker. I have some money that I earned from an inheritance, and I worked hard to increase it. And thanks to that, I travel to all my destinations by van or by taking a flight. Don't confuse me. I used to hitchhike, but after that dark night in a small Swedish town, let's just say I'd rather be made fun of than ask for a ride anywhere again. That night, I was much younger. I had finished exploring the town, and nothing it had caught my attention. I was ready for my next destination, but to leave, I was going to need a ride. I was hitchhiking on the outskirts of the city, and to my surprise, it wasn't a car that opened the door for me. It was a bus. A bus in the middle of nowhere? It seemed a bit suspicious to me, and even more so when they let me pass for free. But when I saw the bus was full, I was no longer afraid. If there is something that characterizes small cities and towns, is their kindness. Being someone from the city, maybe I wasn't used to someone doing something selfless for someone else. Relaxed, I went to a shared seat in the middle of the bus. Next to me, I met a girl who kindly let me on the window side. I told her there was no need, but she insisted, and to tell the truth, I wanted to see a bit more of the scenery, and since the girl lived here, I'm sure she was used to it. I just sat there, enjoying the ride, until I started to feel something strange. The girl next to me was staring at me. Her eyes were lustful, and her hand was on top of my leg. The girl approached me very suddenly. I knew that anyone else would have accepted, but I had a girlfriend and I didn't want to do something I would regret, so I pushed her away. At my action, she was surprised, but to my surprise, her smile got bigger. Before I knew it, I noticed that everyone on the bus was looking at me. Everyone had a big smile on their face. Their smile was not evil, it was more like generous. From one second to the next, everyone was talking to me in Swedish. I didn't understand what they were saying, but they all had very happy and cordial looks on their faces. I'm not going to lie to you, even though these people didn't seem to want to do anything to me, they were scary. I tried to tell them that I didn't understand them, but to no avail. These people kept talking and talking. They didn't even seem to be trying to understand me. One person made a shishing sound and everyone turned around. It was a woman in a robe. The person was very tall and imposing. She appeared to be over 6 feet tall. Her features were neutral and her skin too white. Her gaze was as generous and calm as the rest of the people. But unlike them, she seemed to speak to me with more conviction and in English.
Hello, young man. My name is Dahlia. I don't want you to be scared. None of us are going to hurt you. They just seem to have made a mistake. You're not from here, are you?
No, I'm just an explorer. I asked for a ride back to town. This girl tried to kiss me and suddenly, everyone was talking to me. Everyone here is so weird. Is this a cult or something?
Ah, cult. What an imagination you have, young man. This is not a cult or anything like that. We are just people from the church in town. We were in the middle of an atonement trip. I saw how the driver invited you to get in. It seemed strange to me, but I didn't say anything, since I thought he knew you for sure.
No problem. If you don't mind, I'll get out of here. Can you tell him that?
Of course. I can tell him, but I won't. If you do that, you'll interrupt our journey of atonement. No one can get off once we've started. It would ruin everything.
Oh, and where does the journey end?
In the mountains, young man.
And then we'll come back.
You're so innocent. No one will come back from that trip. We'll throw ourselves down the mountains.
When the woman said that, I thought it was probably a joke. Maybe I misunderstood. This couldn't be happening. Was I being part of a mass suicide? I was desperate to get off. If the door was locked, I would go out the window. As soon as I tried to escape, the girl gave some instructions in Swedish, and before I knew it, there were about 10 people grabbing me. The people threw me to the floor, and while some were holding my hands and feet, others were caressing me. They didn't do it in a violent or sarcastic way. They just stroked my head like a mother would do to her child to calm him down. I screamed as loud as I could, but no one heard my screams. I was trapped on this bus with these people who were prepared to take their own lives and drag me down with them. In an act of desperation, I pretended to calm down, and when the people were no longer holding me so tightly, I grabbed one of the girls and put the survival knife I was carrying to her neck. The rest of the people were still smiling. They still seemed oblivious to what was happening. I made my way through the bus to the back. Some people approached me. Others just looked at me from their seats smiling. Before I knew it, one of the people sitting on the bus jumped on top of me while another held the knife. The girl I was holding hostage bit my arm, and as I screamed in pain, I could only see the girl laughing at me as if knowing that what I was doing was useless. In a last act of rebellion, I shook myself with all my strength and rammed everyone I could on my way to my window, which was the only one left open. Attentive to my movements, some passengers tried to close it, but it was stuck. I took advantage of this moment to jump out before they managed to close it, and as I was falling down a slope, I could see the people on the bus waving at me. They all had huge smiles on their faces. The person who stood out the most was the tall girl, who waved to me as if she was saying goodbye to a great friend who was going on a trip. That was the last time I saw the bus or any of its passengers. When I returned to the city and reported everything to the police, a search was made for the bus. Initially, it was not found, but after a few days of searching, they found the bus and the passengers. All were dead after having fallen to the bottom of a cliff. Because of the distance the bus was from the fall, the police noticed that this was not an accident. Many of the passengers were smiling, but others died with a look of panic on their faces. In their last moments of life, it seems that they regretted it. As for me, I never hitchhiked again, and to be honest, I never took public transportation again, even in the city. When I tell people that I climb mountains, but I'm afraid of public transportation, they all laugh. If they had gone through the same thing I did, they would be afraid too.
To begin with this story, I have to tell you one thing. I don't promote or support hitchhiking. I believe that riding with someone unknown or giving a lift to some stranger could lead to some serious danger, and this story will tell you exactly how dangerous it could be. While growing up, I had an aunt called Cindy. She was my father's older sister and the best person I knew. She was the most kind-hearted, gentle, and helpful person I've ever met. She believed in helping others more than anything. She was a good person who not only preached about karma, but also practiced it. She always said that if you do good, only good will come to you. Unfortunately, that wasn't true. Terrible things happen to good people all the time. Back when I was only a teenager, I always looked up to her. She was the eldest child of a relatively poor couple. My grandparents both worked in a factory to make ends meet back in the 1980s, when my aunt, my father, and their brother were little. It was really astonishing how brilliant she was since her childhood and how she made a good fortune for herself. And back in the 2000s, when I was a teenager, she was a proud owner of 2 photo studios. However, one of her studios was in the city we lived in, and the other was in the next town over, a 2-hour drive from ours. At least 2 or 3 days in a week, Aunt Cindy would drive back and forth between her 2 studios to make sure everything was functioning smoothly. Now, let me tell you, we live in Arizona, and this state is famous for Las Vegas and its deserts. So the road between the 2 towns went through a desert. Although Cindy was an expert driver and she had made this trip a million times before, we used to be worried about her whenever she used to visit her other studio. She was married and had 2 kids my age. So not only did her business need her, but so did her family. We often talked of how innocent and tender-hearted she was, and we always worried that people might take advantage of her. One afternoon, during the summer of 2005, she was making a regular trip back to town from her other studio. Now, summers in Arizona are especially hot. The temperatures are 100 degrees, and in the desert, it's batshit hot. On this trip, she was driving through the desert with her AC on full blast, when in the distance, she saw a man sitting by the road. As he noticed her car approaching him, he raised his hand and stuck his thumb out, showing the world-class sign asking for a lift. My aunt, being her too kind self, thought it was horrible for a man to be stranded in the middle of the desert in such heat. So she stopped the car in front of him and rolled down the passenger side window.
"How may I help you, sir? Do you need anything?"
She asked the man, who had now stood up and was standing by her open window.
"Yeah, actually, could you give me a ride into the city?"
Without thinking much, my aunt agreed.
"Sure. Put your bag in the back seat and hop in."
She unlocked the car doors for the man, and he sat in the passenger side seat.
"Thank you, ma'am. Thanks for driving me to the city."
"Oh, no problem, sir. And please, call me Cindy."
"Thanks, Cindy. I'm Paul."
"Nice to meet you, Paul. So, why are you in the middle of the desert without a ride? I hope you don't mind me asking."
She asked him as she drove the car towards the city. They had a good 1.5-hour journey pending.
"Well, I could not live in my home anymore and didn't want to live in the same town anymore, so I decided to start fresh in another. But I don't have much money. Rather, I don't have any money. And that's why I'm hitchhiking in the first place."
Nodding her head, my aunt didn't pry into Paul's personal life anymore. Instead, they spoke of several other topics for the next half hour.
"What do you think about a pit stop? We grab some lunch and head back on our way."
Cindy asked Paul when they had finished almost half of their journey.
I'm good. You can go ahead and have your lunch. I don't mind waiting in the car or maybe out of it, however you prefer,"
Paul said, somewhat shyly and timidly. Cindy, of course, had a big heart and offered to buy Paul lunch, and so...
"But you must be hungry. You walked so much in the desert before I picked you up. I bet you must be starving. Oh, and don't worry about the money. I got you covered. My treat. Do you like hamburgers and Coke?"
Paul was floored. His cheeks turned slightly red, and not from the heat. He nervously and reluctantly accepted her offer.
Well, hamburger and Coke do sound good.
We're settled then. Would you mind staying here in the car while I get us some food?
Sure. I'll wait for you in here.
Now, a normal person would say that it was her biggest mistake leaving her car with a stranger. But Cindy believed in good deeds and walked off towards the diner to grab him lunch. She not only bought a hamburger and Coke for Paul, but also packed some sandwiches and a few bottles of water for later, as she knew he had no money for food. When she walked out of the diner, her car was still there, and Paul was patiently waiting for her in it. When she gave him his order and the extra food, Paul was almost near tears. He accepted it and thanked her for it throughout the rest of their journey.
It means a lot, Cindy. This is the first good thing someone has done for me in a long while. I really appreciate it.
Oh, don't worry. I just don't want you to sleep hungry. I believe everyone deserves a second chance. And if you wish to start fresh, I'm just helping you in a small way.
Soon they reached the town, and Paul asked her to drop him off downtown, not far from my aunt's home.
I hope everything turns out as you want it to, Paul,
Cindy told him as he was getting out of her car.
Thanks, Cindy. And I hope so. You're very kind. Also, could you please give me your number? I'd like to call you up and tell you if I make it.
Without a second thought, Cindy handed him a sheet of paper with her number on it.
Here you go, and I would love to hear from you sometime.
With that, they both parted ways. Now, you may think this was the most wholesome hitchhiking story ever, but the true twist comes ahead. A few days later, Cindy got a phone call from an unknown number. She picked it up and...
Hello?
Before she could speak a word more or inquire who it was, the person on the other end...
Hey, Cindy. It's me, Paul. You gave me a lift last week. I hope you remember me. Now, I know you didn't expect to get a call from me so soon, but for last week, I couldn't stop thinking about you. You have no idea what you've done. I was at my lowest when you picked me up in that desert. I had totally planned to get into your car, rape you, murder you, then dump your body in the desert for the vultures to eat, then steal your car and get to the city. But instead, I met you, and you were so kind to me that I couldn't go through with my plan. I felt so ashamed of myself. I just couldn't do it to a kind and generous soul like yours. If you were so nice to me, I assume you're a lovely mother and wife, as you told me during our ride that you have kids and are married. I couldn't take you away from your family for my selfishness. And then you bought me lunch. My own family hasn't bought me anything in years. I was moved to tears by your kindness. And I didn't want to live in the city. I was looking for a fresh start because I had murdered a man just a couple of hours ago in that town, and I was on the run. But meeting you made me want to be nice. Buy someone lunch today. It's a long way for me, but I'm willing to try. Thank you once again, and I will not contact you after this ever again. Have a happy life.
And Paul hung up the phone. Cindy couldn't believe what she had heard. But a couple of days later, when she was back at her other studio, she heard the news about a murder and the suspect turning himself in. This story taught me both the power of kindness and to never let anyone hitchhike in your vehicle. I always stay away from hitchhikers, and so should you. Not everyone is as lucky as Cindy.
Being a social worker means I get to work with people from all facets of life. Be it homeless, the sick, the poor, sometimes even kids, or the rich and elite who fund my no-profit to save taxes. For the past 20 years, I have been running my own nonprofit organization that helps the needy to live a better life. However, for the past 4 years, my organization also helps to save and rehabilitate trafficked kids and women. It's truly disturbing how cruel people can be towards others of their own kind. Every year since, hundreds of kids and women come and stay in my organization. Some for a long time, while others till their families or guardians came to get them. Last week, a little boy named Marcus arrived at my organization. As a protocol, each person who arrives at my NGO for any kind of help is required to fill out some documentation and go through a medical examination to determine if they are healthy. As many of the kids are still very young, like Marcus, our staff fill these forms on their behalf. When Marcus arrived along with a couple of other kids, I knew that the children were saved by the cops from a trafficking ring. They had been kidnapped from their homes, school, playgrounds, grocery stores, etc., and were trafficked. It's sad, but the stats say that every year, more and more women and kids are sold into the flesh trade worldwide. And helping these kids and women to get back on their feet and return to their life is what we do at my NGO. Marcus was one of them, and although all the kids were pretty scared and shaken from the trauma they experienced, Marcus seems weirdly immune to it all. When it was his turn to answer my questions to fill out the form, I got to learn a lot about this kid. "Hey, buddy, you're next. Would you mind coming in with me?" I went to the lobby outside of my office and called Marcus inside for his documentation. Without even looking at me, he followed me inside. He sure wasn't older than 5, so I had to help him sit on the chair. "Is your name Marcus?" I asked. Without lifting his head, he just nodded his reply. "How old are you, Marcus?" I asked again, even though deep down I knew he would be around 7 or 8. "5, he said. I was a little shocked because he was too little to be 5. "What is your surname, buddy?" This time he looked at me and I saw a sad, haunting expression on his face. "Marcus Miller," he said. From the way he spoke, it seemed that he was 7, even though his size said otherwise. "Hey, Marcus, would you mind telling me more about your parents and family?" I always try a friendly approach and ask kids about their families in a very casual manner. Most of the kids who had happy families before being trafficked started talking about them. But Marcus just stared at me with his big, hazed eyes. "Marcus, please tell me about your mom and dad." This time, I was gentler with the boy because I sensed something was off. "My dad sold me to a bad man for money, and my mom drinks too much. So, she is always lost in her own world," the boy replied in a timid and sad voice. I was shocked to know that this boy was sold to the traffickers by his own father for some cash. But before I could reply or react, Marcus continued. "My dad took me out of school when I was in the 1st grade because we couldn't afford it. My mom is a stay-at-home mom and is drunk all the time. My dad does some work occasionally because we don't have much money." I felt like my heart was ripped out of my chest after listening to his words. "Where do your parents live, Marcus?" Something snapped inside him, and his dull and sad demeanor changed to panic in an instant. "Please, please don't look for them. Please, please, I don't want to go back home." That was a shocking thing to hear again, because all of these rescued kids always wanted to go back to their mommy and daddy. "Do you not want to go back home?" "No." He frantically shook his head. "Did something happen? You can tell me. It's safe here." "My dad hit me and so did my mom. They never loved me. They always fought about money and cursed at me. They do not want me or love me. Can I stay here, please?" It was a tough call to make, but I decided not to look for his parents and let him stay here. The good part, he wasn't physically harmed and was a healthy kid. A little small for his age, but I was sure he would grow with some love and care. But I still decided to keep an eye on him to make sure he was okay and didn't show any signs of any kind of trauma. Turns out, Marcus loved to draw most of the time. Unlike other kids who love to play and watch TV, Marcus just sat in a corner and drew. On one such evening, I sat beside him to see how he was doing. "What are you drawing, Marcus?" He looked at me and passed me his drawing sheet. On that sheet was a drawing of a woman. Marcus had drawn the face of the woman and her body. The woman was very disfigured, but I ignored it because most of the kids' drawings are weird and disfigured. But instead of using colors, he had drawn the woman in all black. "Why don't you use any other colors?" I asked him. "And who is this woman?" He looked at me with those big eyes for a while.
"She is the one that took me."
"Took you?" For a second, I didn't know what he meant. But then I understood who the woman was. It was the one who bought him from his father.
"She used to watch me,"
he further added. I had no idea what to say or do, so instead, I decided to check out his other drawings, and sure enough, all his other drawings were of the same woman, drawn in black. It was so disturbing holding his sketches in hand and not knowing what to do, so I decided to dig in a bit more. "Do you know where this woman is now?"
"No,"
he said.
"but she still watches me."
"What?" Marcus just pointed towards the open window. And I saw a shadow of a woman walking away. I ran towards the window and peeked out, but there was no one there. I looked back at Marcus, and he was still drawing the same woman. Now, with the drawing of that woman in my hand and the knowledge that the child traffickers are keeping an eye on my NGO and all the kids I save, I feel very scared and worried for the safety of these kids. I feel so confused and lost that I don't know what I should do. Call the cops to warn the authorities, or was the shadow of the woman a figment of my imagination? The next story is a dramatization of a true story that almost ruined the life of Ada, a victim of domestic abuse. In this video, a neighbor managed to capture a moment of Ada's fight with her partner. What no one could have anticipated at the time was that this was only the prelude to something much worse. I don't know how many of you have a child, but those of you who do know that you would give everything for them. But what can you do when you can't help but lose them? How do you live if you know that, intentional or not, it's your fault that something so terrible happened? My name is Ada, and this is the story of how a nice vacation in a 5-star hotel turned into the most terrifying night of my life. Anyway, I must admit that things between Greg and I were not very good. Greg and I had been a couple for several years, and he was not the father of my son Robbie. His father had died in a car accident many years before, and it was hard for us to move on after that. But we did. Gregory started as a good man. He was on good terms with my son and seemed to be always looking out for what I needed. Everything was going well, but over time, things started to change. Greg became more and more jealous. At first, I couldn't go out with my male friends. After a while, I couldn't go out with my female friends either, because according to him, they were a bad influence. Little by little, I started to distance myself from all the people who cared about me, and I, without realizing it, allowed it. A few years later, things became more violent. Greg would hit me for almost any reason. I thought about leaving him, but he would change his personality and apologize to me. This may seem strange, but I was very innocent, and since he was a good father to my son and didn't do anything to him, I forgave him so I wouldn't take his father away from him. As you can imagine, things got worse and worse over time. Everything was going very badly lately, much worse than normal, so I decided to do something for the three of us to have a good time. I saved what money I could and invited us to take a little vacation to a 5-star hotel in paradise. Robbie was very happy, but I could tell something was bothering Greg, and when we got to the hotel, he let me know loudly. Greg was furious that I had saved that money without telling him. He complained that I could use that money for the house, and furious, he yelled at me and worried about what else I was hiding from him. Robbie and I started crying, and Greg stormed off to the bar. A few minutes later, a hotel security person approached me and asked me what had happened. He seemed genuinely concerned, and that gesture made me cry again. On impulse, I hugged him, and as I did so, I could see Greg in the distance looking at me, even more furious than before. I thought he was going to come and confront the guard, but instead, He just turned around in the hallway and went back to the bar, while I was sure he thought I hadn't seen him. That same night, Greg, without telling me, came to bed a few hours later. I didn't know whether to be happy or scared. I was just glad to have a relatively quiet night. The next day, Greg pretended nothing had happened and took Robbie to the hotel pool. He had made friends with the neighbors, and they arranged for our 4 kids to play in the pool. Greg might be a very aggressive person with little patience, but with the people outside, he was really very charismatic. So I wasn't surprised that he had already made friends. He told me to take a break from Robbie and come down to the pool when I was ready, to which I smiled and agreed. A few minutes later, someone knocked on the door. It was the security guard from the night before. The man only came in to ask me how I was doing from the day before and if everything was in order. That night, I didn't tell him what had happened, but it was obvious. Anyway, I didn't want to get him involved and told him everything was fine. The man was concerned and came to ask me without any self-interest. I could tell there were no ulterior motives, and that reassured me. When the man left, the door rang again a few seconds later. Had he forgotten something? I went over to open the door, but it wasn't the security guard. It was Greg, and he was furious. "Greg!" Without answering me, the huge man grabbed me by the neck and pulled me back. I had been through this many times before. I knew what was happening. But something was different. I had never seen Gregory so furious. Something in his look terrified me. I saw him angry many times, but this time, his eyes were full of decision. His eyes were not filled with that explosive anger he always had. This was premeditated. As he pulled a huge knife from his hands, the terrifying man kicked the bed with enormous force to corner me, and it fell on top of me. What was he doing with that knife? Did he want to kill me? Greg rushed at me with his arms outstretched and knife in hand, but I used the same bed he threw to corner me as a shield. I hid between the wall and the bed, straining so he couldn't pull the bed out. I could feel the sounds of the knife going through the bed to get me, but the knife was too small, and the tip of the knife barely pierced the bed. There was no way it could cut me. In an act of desperation, Greg pushed even harder to pull the bed out, and when I saw that he was succeeding, I pushed the bed forward. His strength, added to mine, caused the man to stagger and fall onto the bed, and I took advantage of this to open the door and escape. As I ran, I heard Greg yelling at me, "Run, Ada, but you'll see that I can be much worse. I'll hurt you where it hurts." As I ran, I kept thinking about his words. Hurt me where it hurts. At that very moment, I stopped and my blood froze. Greg was going to do something to Robbie. I ran to the pool as fast as I could, but I didn't know where I was or how to get there. I stopped to ask several employees, and they pointed me in the right direction. Once I got downstairs, I entered the pool and heard a lot of screaming. It wasn't hard to tell where they were coming from. Next to our neighbors, who were frightened old men and a little boy, Greg was drowning Robbie. I lunged violently at the man who was trying to kill my son and held him long enough for Robbie to come up for air for even a second. But the man pushed me back and I hit the sink, hurting my hip. Filled with pain, I tried to fight Gregory again, but there was no point. He was still choking my son with absolute ease. Out of nowhere, our rescue came. The security guard, along with 2 other employees, jumped into the pool and stopped Greg. One of the elders jumped into the fray and pulled Robbie out. Meanwhile, between the 3 men, they were barely able to stop furious Greg, but little by little, more and more people arrived to stop him. Our attention was focused on Robbie, who was not breathing. After giving him unresponsive mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, the boy spit up water and began to cough weakly. I breathed a sigh of relief. My son was safe. Gregory was arrested for attempted murder, and by the time I got out of jail, I had a restraining order against him. My son and I grew up and matured over time. I will never again put my son at risk by exposing him to someone like this. I know Greg will someday get out of prison and may not respect the restraining order. But when that happens, I will be prepared to confront him.